Okay, let's try to finish out this section for our Scouts' first day of school. There's going to be a couple more important things that happen here that have to do with class and poverty and education, and then when Scout gets home to talk to Atticus about the day. All right, so lunchtime comes and Miss Caroline asks everybody who goes home to lunch, "Hold up your hand," said Miss Caroline, breaking into my new grudge against Calpurnia. Everyone who brings his lunch, the town children did so, and she looked us over. Everybody who brings his lunch put it on top of his desk. Molasses buckets appeared from nowhere, and the ceiling danced with metallic light. Miss Caroline walked up and down the rows, peering and poking into lunch containers, nodding if the contents pleased her, frowning a little at others. She stopped at Walter Cunningham's desk. "Where's yours?" she asked. Walter Cunningham's face told everybody in the first grade he had hookworms. His absence of shoes told us how he got them. People caught hookworms going barefooted in barnyards and hog wallows. If Walter owned any shoes, he would have worn them the first day of school and then discarded them until midwinter. He did have on a clean shirt and neatly mended overalls. Okay, so we're getting introduced to a new family in the town, and it is the Cunninghams. And here's the younger son, Walter Cunningham. And we get a description of his clothing and the fact that he has no lunch. So he's got no lunch. And Miss Caroline doesn't understand. Remember, she's an outsider. She's new to the town. She doesn't know about the town's families and so on. So he also has some kind of disease from going around barefooted. Why is he going around barefoot? He doesn't own any shoes. If he had owned any shoes, he would have worn them. So he's very poor, and he only seems to come on the first day of school. But we can see he had a clean shirt and neatly mended overalls. So although he's poor, he's, as much as possible, he's clean and neat. So his clothes have been fixed, they're mended, sewed up, but they're clean at least. "Did you forget your lunch this morning?" asked Miss Caroline. Walter looked straight ahead. I saw a muscle jump in his skinny jaw. "Did you forget it this morning?" asked Miss Caroline. Walter's jaw twitched again. "Yeb'm," he finally mumbled. Miss Caroline went to her desk and opened her purse. "Here's a quarter," she said to Walter. "Go and eat downtown today. You can pay me back tomorrow." Walter shook his head. "No'm, thank you, ma'am," he drawled softly. Impatience crept into Miss Caroline's voice. "Here, Walter, come get it." Walter shook his head. When Walter shook his head a third time, someone whispered, "Go on and tell her, Scout." I turned around and saw most of the townspeople and the entire bus delegation looking at me. Miss Caroline and I had conferred twice already, and they were looking at me in the innocent assurance that familiarity breeds understanding. I rose graciously on Walter's behalf. Miss Caroline?" "What is it, Jean Louise?" "Miss Caroline, he's a Cunningham." I sat back down. "What, Jean Louise?" I thought I had made things sufficiently clear. It was clear enough to the rest of us. Walter Cunningham was sitting there lying his head off. He didn't forget his lunch. He didn't have any. He had none today, nor would he have any tomorrow or the next day. He had probably never seen 3 quarters together at the same time in his life. I tried again. "Walter's one of the Cunninghams, Miss Caroline." "I beg your pardon, Jean Louise." "That's okay, ma'am. You'll get to know all the country folks after a while. The Cunninghams never took anything they can't pay back. No church baskets and no script stamps. They never took anything off anybody. They get along on what they have. They don't have much, but they get along on it. My special knowledge of the Cunningham tribe, one branch, that is, was gained from events last winter. Walter's father was one of Atticus's clients. After a dreary conversation in our living room one night about his entailment, we'll come back to that, before Mr. Cunningham left, he said, "Mr. Finch, I don't know when I'll ever be able to pay you." "Let that be the least of your worries, Walter," Atticus said. When Jem and I asked what entailment was, and Jem described it as a condition of having your tail in a crack, I asked Atticus if Mr. Cunningham would ever pay us. Not in money, Atticus said, but before the year's out, I'll have been paid. You watch. We watched. One morning, Jem and I found a load of stove wood in the backyard. Later, a sack of hickory nuts appeared on the back steps. With Christmas came a crate of smilax and holly. That spring we found a croaker sack full of turnip greens. Atticus said Mr. Cunningham had more than paid him. Okay, so we learned some things about the Cunningham family here. So the Cunningham scout shows us they don't beg or steal. So they provide for themselves, and they have a kind of dignity. Okay, they pay their debts somehow. How did you pay? With produce from their farm. Okay, they're farmers, right? So you couldn't pay with money for the legal services, so they pay with food, with crops. But they pay, right? They're not dishonest or anything like that. Why does he pay you like that, I asked. Because that's the only way he can pay me. He has no money. Are we poor, Atticus? Atticus nodded. We are indeed. Jem's nose wrinkled. Are we as poor as the Cunninghams? Not exactly. The Cunninghams are country folks, farmers. And the crash hit them hardest. What crash? This was the 1929 stock market crash. And that was a big factor that contributed to the Great Depression. So farmers got really hit hard too. Atticus said professional people were poor because the farmers were poor. As Maycomb County was farm country, nickels and dimes were hard to come by for doctors and dentists and lawyers. Entailment was only a part of Mr. Cunningham's vexations. The acres not entailed were mortgaged to the hilt, and little cash he made went to interest. If he held his mouth right, Mr. Cunningham could get a WPA job, but his land would go to ruin if he left it. And he was willing to go hungry to keep his land and vote as he pleased. Mr. Cunningham, said Atticus, came from a set breed of men. As the Cunninghams had no money to pay a lawyer, they simply paid us what they had. Did you know, said Atticus, that Dr. Reynolds works the same way? He charges some folks a bushel of potatoes for delivery of a baby. Miss Scout, if you give me your attention, I'll tell you what entailment is. Jem's definitions are very nearly accurate sometimes. If I could have explained these things to Miss Caroline, I would have saved myself some inconvenience and Miss Caroline's subsequent mortification, but it was beyond my ability to explain things as well as Atticus. So I said, You're shaming him, Miss Caroline. Walter hasn't got a quarter at home to bring you, and you can't use any stove wood. Miss Caroline stood stock still, then grabbed me by the collar, hauled me back to her desk. Jean Louise, I've had about enough of you this morning, she said. You're starting off on the wrong foot in every way, my dear. Hold out your hand. I thought she was going to spit in it, which was the only reason anybody in Maycomb held out his hand. It was a time-honored method of sealing oral contracts. Wondering what bargain we had made, I turned to the class for an answer, but the class looked back at me in puzzlement. Miss Caroline picked up her ruler, gave me half a dozen little quick pats, then told me to stand in the corner. A storm of laughter broke loose when it finally occurred to the class that Miss Caroline had whipped me. Okay, they're laughing because she gave her these little pats on the hand with a stick, with a ruler, but normally, they've been beat a lot harder than that. Miss Caroline's pretty delicate. Point is, Miss Caroline has no idea what's going on, that she's shaming Walter Cunningham because his family's so poor. She's trying to be helpful and give him some money for lunch, and he can't pay her back, and he's not telling her what's going on. Miss Scout is trying to educate Miss Caroline with a cultural education, right? She knows about Maycomb, but Miss Caroline is a stranger. She doesn't understand Maycomb's society yet. All right, so anyway, Miss Caroline bursts into tears and starts crying at the end. She's frustrated. She doesn't know what's going on. Next chapter comes. They're in the schoolyard. Scout gets angry, starts fighting Walter, and actually Jem breaks in and invites Walter over for lunch. Okay, they say dinner, but it's lunchtime. They're on break. Okay, so their dad is friends with Walter's dad, and Jem says, "Don't worry, Scout. She's just crazy. She won't fight you anymore. Just come on over for lunch." And so they're gonna go home to Scout and Jem's house to have some lunch there. Now, a couple of things are important when they get there and have lunch. Okay, so Jem ran to the kitchen, asked Calpurnia to set an extra plate, and we had company. Atticus greeted Walter and began a discussion about crops. Neither Jem nor I could follow. So notice Atticus is sensitive to others' needs and viewpoints. He starts talking about farming with Walter. Well, Walter knows about farming. He's going to feel comfortable. And they're talking about that. Now, while Walter piled food on his plate, he and Atticus talked together like two men to the wonderment of Jem and me. Atticus was expounding upon farm problems when Walter interrupted to ask if there was any molasses in the house. That's like a sugar syrup. Atticus summoned Calpurnia, who returned bearing the syrup pitcher. She stood waiting for Walter to help himself. Walter poured syrup on his vegetables and meat with a generous hand. He would probably have poured it into his milk glass had I not asked him what in the Sam Hill he was doing. The silver saucer clattered when he replaced the pitcher, and he quickly put his hands in his lap. Then he ducked his head. So what happened? Walter is poor. He doesn't have syrup. Syrup is a luxury, right? It's something extra. It costs more money. Well, Atticus has it. He's a lawyer, right? But Scout shames him. He poured syrup all over all his food. It's not normal. So Calpurnia brings her out, and she gives her an education in manners. She says, "There's some folks who don't eat like us, but you ain't called on to contradict them at the table when they don't. The boy's your company, and if he wants to eat up the tablecloth, you let him, you hear? He ain't company, Cal. He's just a Cunningham. Hush your mouth, don't matter who they are, and anybody sets foot in this house, yo company, and you let me catch you remarking on their ways like you was so high and mighty. Yo folks might be better than the Cunninghams, but it don't count for nothing the way you're disgracing them. If you can't act fit to eat at the table, you can just sit here and eat in the kitchen." Okay, so here is a moral education coming from Calpurnia. We're going to see she has the same principle that Atticus teaches, which is basically do to others how you would want to be treated. Don't embarrass him. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to have to get to Atticus's final comment on this whole situation of embarrassing Walter, and some other incident that happens at the school with Miss Caroline here in a moment. So there'll be one more video on this section. All right, thanks.